Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, books, and in popular culture. Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome again to our podcast. My name is Bruce Markison. As always, I'm joined by producer and co host Tracy Asteria. Tracy, what's going on with you?
Oh gosh, not too much, Bruce. We've actually hit some cooler weather now here in Nova Scotia. So we're really starting to kick it into the holiday season. And I wanted to share with the listeners and the YouTube viewers just a little creepy Nova Scotia tradition. Um, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it, but at one of our biggest malls in Nova Scotia, we have a 56-foot animatronic talking Christmas tree. I kid you not, Bruce. He
Wow.
made his first appearance in 1983, and he was just basically like this giant tree whose mouth was like talking branches, and it was kind of goofy. But of course, that was the 80s. It was like a goofy period of time.
Mhm.
But, you know, it was all in the fun of the holiday season. He was there to kind of like greet the children as they make their way to go see Santa Claus.
Sure.
But later, his name is Woody the Christmas Talking Tree. He evolved into something somewhat of a nightmare, quite honestly. Woody's face, they actually gave him a face, and he was transformed into kind of like Thomas the Tank Engine's kind of face, if you're familiar with Thomas the Tank Engine or the Squid Games, like that really big face. And, it was really super creepy. And the tree's smile was so scary. I remember that growing up as a kid. And I can't, I had nightmares, honestly. But he was a big hit with kids and with parents, and he became like this huge icon. But about 15 years ago, he was retired. They kind of like put him into hibernation, and nobody ever heard anything from him again. But
Mhm.
2021, they brought him back as kind of like a, glad you got over COVID. Here's something to bring back a creepy tradition. They brought Woody the Christmas talking tree back to this mall. And anyway, he was no longer as creepy as he had been. People actually likened him to looking like Kim Kardashian
Oh,
of
wow.
all things. And, sometimes his animatronics would kind of bonk out with his blinking eyes, and it was just really weird, and his mouth would stop moving, and he was just a creepy spectacle. But he became really famous, Bruce. CNN, he was on CNN, and he was also talked about by Jimmy Fallon on his late night show, whatever that Jimmy Fallon has. But I am just going to give you a glimpse of what this looks like. So we are going to just do a very quick share. So there is Woody back
That
from the
is weird.
1983. And I'm just going to let this play. So there's his creepiness. Children had nightmares about him. I personally did too. There's his updated version from 2021 onward. So he's 56 feet, and there is his wonky eyes when his animatronics kind of bonk out. But
Mhm.
that is Woody the Christmas Talking Tree. And, I'm grateful. I haven't seen his updated version in person, but I definitely remember his 1983 version, and it's something that I can't forget.
I don't think I can either. Now, for those listening on Podbean, the initial Woody's kind of a squished in face, not very pleasant looking. The updated one is a little bit better looking, but as you mentioned, one eye's open, one eye shut, and he's got almost like red blush on his face. It's pretty strange.
Yeah, it's bizarre, but
Yeah.
again, he is very famous, but he is very creepy. So he fits in with the horror show. So,
Yeah. So back since 2021, still going strong in 2024?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He demands Cinnabons from the children in order to speak to Santa Claus.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty bizarre.
Yeah, exactly.
A monstrous talking Christmas tree that reminds some of Kim Kardashian. Well, we can end
Gotta
the
love
show
it.
right there.
I know.
Very interesting. Well, Tracy, on this week's show, we're going to talk about a few other things. We're also going to get a little bit serious in our first segment before we have, I guess, more fun in our later segments talking about a couple of films. We're going to start, though, by really trying to do a tribute. Hopefully, we'll do justice to the legendary horror actor Tony Todd, who sadly passed away in November. We're going to reflect on his career, his accomplishments, and really try to put his career in perspective, which I don't think has been done, at least not in any articles that I've seen online. After we talk about the late Tony Todd, we're going to look back at the film for which he's always going to be best known. It's a modern day classic, Candyman from 1992. And then later on, Tracy and I are going to review a new film just out this fall, might still be in some theaters as we speak. It is called Heretic, starring Hugh Grant, and it actually has received pretty good reviews. So we'll talk about that as well. But Tracy, we're going to begin by talking about Tony Todd. He's the man who made the title character in Candyman, really one of the most frightening villains in horror history. Sadly, we lost him on November the 6th. He was 69 years of age. He had apparently been ill for a while, though I had not seen that written about or publicized in any way. So it certainly was shocking to me to hear of his death and shocking to a lot of his fans as well. You look back at Tony Todd, he didn't really start to gain fame within the genre until his late 30s. He was about 38, and that's when he really, I think, put himself on the map of the genre of horror. Uh, he played the heroic role of Ben in the excellent 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead. That was a film that was done in full color, directed by Tom Savini. And Todd did a very good job in that film. And he started to gain some fans in horror after that performance. Then you talk about really the performance that I think turned his career around, and that was 1992. He plays the title character in Candyman. Great movie. This is a film that made him a nationally known star of horror, and he was really the perfect fit for this character. 6 foot 5 inch frame, deep voice. Todd tackled the Candyman role beautifully, making a major name for himself. Also creating, I think, one of the most frightening monsters of modern day cinema. You know, we always go back, we talk about the classic monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, the Wolf Man. We start thinking about monsters of the more modern era. And I guess modern era, could be 1960s, could be 1970s. It really depends on who's defining it. I probably would define it from early 60s on, from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho to the current day. I think that was, for me, the point of demarcation. And during that period of time, you think about some of the monstrous characters that we have had. Michael Myers, Jason, Freddy Krueger. Well, I think Candyman deserves to be put into that category as well. And Tony Todd was the guy who handled that role and really perfected it in so many ways. We look at some of the other film credits, I should say, that he was able to compile. Mentioned Night of the Living Dead, 1990. He did a series of Final Destination movies. He was in Harrison Smith's Death House. Harrison has said great things about him. He also did more recently Hellfest, which is a pretty good movie from 2018. And over the course of his career, Tony Todd became one of the most prolific actors of this current era, this modern era, compiling over 250 acting credits in film and television. And here's a guy who really didn't start to gain a foothold, gain fame until he was in his late 30s, 36, 37, 38, which I believe was the age he was when he made Candyman. So he got kind of a late start, but he certainly made up for lost time. Sadly, we would have loved to have had him for longer. We've seen a lot of actors in recent years continue to perform well into their 70s. And if Todd's health had permitted it, I think very likely that could have happened. Sadly, he didn't have the chance to do so. But 250 acting credits in a career that spans back to late 80s, early 90s. Pretty amazing. And along the way, some very memorable films, some very memorable performances. Tracy, let's get some of your thoughts on Tony Todd. What do you think his impact should be as we look back, his legacy should be as we look back on what he did for horror over the last 35 years?
Oh my gosh, there's so much to say. Like for me, I want to say the first time I ever remember Tony Todd was in the film Candyman that was released way back in 1992. And I unfortunately didn't get to see that in the theater, but I watched it when it came out on video. And I mean, I know I had remembered seeing him in other films growing up, but Candyman is the one that made that lasting impression on me. He was a highly influential figure in the horror genre with a career, like you said, spanning several decades, which is absolutely phenomenal. And just such a distinctive presence that made him an iconic figure in both mainstream and cult horror films. I think his impact on the horror genre goes way beyond his performances. He shaped the portrayal of, the horror villains, the anti-heroes, and his performances, they truly resonate with horror fans and filmmakers. I mean, like you mentioned, that Harrison Smith spoke so highly of Tony Todd. And, his performances were intense, but subtle, if you know what I mean. And it just leaves the viewers feeling on edge. And he didn't have to do anything in your face, gore, screaming and hollering. Like it was just his presence, which was, terrifying in his films. He was authentic, versatile, and relatable with all of his projects. And even as scary as some of his roles were, like Candyman, he's just such a great human being. And overall, again, in over 250 projects, he did things other than horror too. I mean, X-Files, Law and Order, Star Trek, and 21 Jump Street, and MacGyver. And I have to mention the one role that I really loved, and I was really surprised to see him make an appearance in one of my favorite shows, which was Stargate SG-1 on TV. And he had 3 appearances during the series run, and he played a character named Lord Haikon, who was the leader of the Sodan, which is a warrior type role. I mean, his stature, his voice, and his wisdom, it just brought so much to that role. And I really loved it. I just really loved it. And, I did a little bit of looking on IMDb, and there are still 10 unreleased projects that he participated in, including the horror flicks, The Pitchfork Retreat, which also stars Adrienne Barbeau, and The Witching Hour with Michael Madsen. So they're all in post-production. And, I can't wait to see them. And I think that they'll be more meaningful now than they would have been before. Yeah. So I look forward to watching those, and he's going to be missed. I'm going to miss his work and just as a human, but he has so many pieces of work that you can watch every day and just kind of feel a little bit better.
You make a great point mentioning some of the sci-fi roles that he did, roles in other genres, crime dramas. He's one of those guys that, although we are going to remember him most for horror, that was his niche, He was able to do just about anything. You really can consider him not just a great horror actor, but a great actor, period. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about his legacy and his place in history in a moment. But I want to pick up on another thing you mentioned about his personality, his character. I never had the pleasure of meeting or interviewing him. He was at Scaricon at Turning Stone, not far from where I live, at least once, maybe a couple of times. I have never spoken to him, unfortunately, but I did talk to other people who did, and they really praised him for, being this humble, soft-spoken, kind, charming person. We hear this so often about actors in horror, and Tony Todd really epitomized that. He was so different from those on-air roles, those monstrous, villainous roles like Candyman, as frightening as he was in that film and the follow-up films as well. In person, he was nothing like that. Sid Haig was very similar in that way. Sid Haig was this huge guy. Sid had kind of a distinctive, intimidating look to him, but was so easy to talk to. I did interview him. Grateful that I had the chance to do that at a Scaricon. And I was a little intimidated going into that interview just because of the roles that he played and how wild some of his characters could be, how unpredictable they could be. But he was terrific in person. And I get this feeling that Tony Todd, based on what I've heard from others, was very, very similar. One of the things, Tracy, I want to talk about is the legacy of Todd within the genre of horror, but also when looking at great Black actors. Now, for many, many years, the actors who dominated horror, this going back to the 1930s, those Universal classics, almost all of them were white. Many of them were either American citizens or British immigrants, or in the case of Bela Lugosi, they came from, Hungary, Transylvania. He had to obviously learn English, but you didn't have really Black horror stars in those early years, 30s, 40s, 50s. The first time that we actually saw an African-American actor take the lead role in a horror film was not until 1968, which is really not that long ago. To some of the younger generation fans, it might seem like it, but it really isn't. 1968 is not that long ago. And yet it took until then for Dwayne Jones to have that lead role, that heroic role, playing Ben in Night of the Living Dead. So in a lot of ways, when you talk about the great Black actors in horror, they really didn't start to get a chance until the 1960s. Unfortunately for Dwayne Jones, he didn't do a lot of films. I think he only did 6 or 7, maybe 8 films. I think racism in the day limited his opportunities. He also was a guy who loved to teach. He was a college professor. He loved to teach acting, teach the theater. So his career really went in that direction. In addition to Night of the Living Dead, he made one other horror film that's notable. That's Ganja and Hess, which came out in the early 70s. And he's very good in that, although it's not as iconic as Night of the Living Dead. So you've got Dwayne Jones, who made these 2 very significant appearances, but didn't have many chances after that. Looking at other Black actors, William Marshall did a great job in the 2 Blackula movies. But most of William Marshall's roles came in other genres. Here was a classically, theatrically trained actor. He was exceptional on stage. He was exceptional in film. But Blackula, those 2 movies, that was it for him in horror. Calvin Lockhart was in The Beast Must Die, and he's riveting in that, the way that he speaks. He had a very unusual manner of speaking. He wore those all leather outfits. He really commands that film, even more than Peter Cushing, who was a far more famous actor. But unfortunately, Calvin Lockhart, not really many other opportunities to do horror films. Then you think of more recent times, the contemporary era. You've got Wesley Snipes doing the 3 Blade movies, and he was great in all of those. He's done a few other horror films, but there's just not enough quantity there to really, put him in that pantheon and say, he would be the greatest Black horror actor of all time. You have a young actor like a Daniel Kaluuya who is doing very well in a couple of Jordan Peele films,
Mhm.
and he may eventually put together an incredible resume of horror in terms of both, he's certainly there with quality, and eventually too soon to tell.
Mhm.
Then you have a guy like Samuel L. Jackson, who has done, Deep Blue Sea. He did 1408. He's done Glass, among other horror films. But horror is not really what defines him. He's done so many different, action, thriller, comedies, even. He's become kind of a larger than life character, also doing, commercials on TV. I don't necessarily think of him, though, as a horror actor first and foremost, and I just don't know if the volume of work is quite there. The only other actor I can think of in terms of Black actors that I would put in the same category of a Tony Todd or close to that category would be someone like Ken Foree, who is, I think, a very underrated actor. He did Dawn of the Dead back in the mid 1970s. From Beyond, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. He was in The Dentist, the Corbin Burnson film. He then did the remake of Dawn of the Dead. He did The Devil's Rejects for Rob Zombie, did the remake of Halloween, The Lords of Salem as well. He's obviously developed a close relationship with Rob Zombie in some of his films. In terms of volume, it's certainly there for Ken Foree, and his performances have always been very good. But I just don't know that there's the impact of what we've seen from someone like the man we're talking about, Tony Todd, in terms of Candyman and some of these other great movies that he has performed in. Foree certainly has the volume of work, and he has done a very good job. But I don't know that any of those films are quite as iconic as something like Candyman.
Right.
I guess some people could make that argument. I would tend to disagree. So, having looked at all these other actors, Ken Foree, Samuel L. Jackson, Daniel Kaluuya, Wesley Snipes, Calvin Lockhart, William Marshall, Dwayne Jones, all very fine actors. But if you're talking about the best Black actor within the genre of horror in history, in my mind, maybe I'm missing somebody, in my mind, it's got to be Tony Todd. He, to me, is the choice. Foree is the only one who really comes close. And at this point, I would give Tony Todd the advantage. Then you can move on beyond that argument, getting beyond race, and you can just talk about the best actor, period, in horror. And if you look at the last 40 years or so, which covers the span of Tony Todd's professional career, he's got to at least be in a category of top 10 horror actors or top 15 horror actors. Maybe not at the top, but you have to talk about him when you also talk about a Nicolas Cage, Toni Collette, Jamie Lee Curtis, Brad Dourif, with the Chucky roles over the years. Also, he was great in Exorcist 3.
Mhm.
We think of Robert Englund, Nightmare on Elm Street, some other films. One of my favorite actresses, Vera Farmiga, who's been great in the Conjuring series and was wonderful on Bates Motel on television. The great Anthony Hopkins, Silence of the Lambs. He's done others, but hey, Silence of the Lambs by itself, pretty impactful. Christina Ricci with Sleepy Hollow, Addams Family, among other productions. Patrick Wilson, also from the Conjuring series. These are 10 modern day or contemporary era horror actors that come to mind. And in my opinion, you have to at least put Tony Todd into the argument. Maybe he's not at the very top, but at the very least, he's in the lower third, maybe the middle third, maybe a little bit higher, depending on your opinion. So this is a guy that really needs to be recognized, not just for a great career, but within the context of horror. I think he's one of the all-time greats. And that's something that I don't know that I've necessarily seen people talk about, at least not yet. I know he did just pass away, about a month ago. Maybe we need more time in terms of perspective, but I really feel this guy deserves recognition as just an all-time fabulous actor of horror.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I mean, I can't say enough good things about Tony Todd, but I do want to say that I would probably place him in the top 5. That's where I would place him, in the top 5 for sure,
Mm.
along with, it would be Tony Todd and Robert Englund and, Nicolas Cage for sure, and Jamie Lee Curtis. Like I think he belongs there in that top 5.
I think you can make a pretty good argument for that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to dispute that at all. I think that's very reasonable when you look at the volume of work, but also the quality and the fact that he had that iconic film, Candyman, which really
Absolutely.
stands at the top. You put that whole package together, and I think that's very reasonable to say, yeah, Tony Todd, top 5.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we want to do in continuing to pay tribute to Tony Todd on this episode of the Ghostly Gallery, we want to look back at that film that really did hallmark his career, 1992, Candyman. Both Tracy and I will give our thoughts on the movie. And this, Tracy, was a film that I first saw in the theater back in my single days. Actually saw this while on a date during its initial run. So I got to see it on the big screen in the theater. And as I always like to tell people, the date was good, but the film was better. I hope my date's not hearing that. Well, it's been over 30 years now. Anyway, with a large screen presentation, stereo sound in the theater, this was a movie that I really got to see in its full glory, became even more powerful. And it's really, Tracy, one of the few films that has truly scared me. I've seen so many horror movies over the years that I kind of brush them off in terms of the fear factor. Not too many of them are going to scare me, but there have been a few. Night of the Living Dead is one. The original Omen with Gregory Peck and Lee Remick is another.
Mhm.
And Candyman would have to be a third. There are probably a couple of others, but those three, I think, have had the most effect on me in terms of pure fear factor. Now, the movie Candyman is based on a story written by another great horror mind, Clive Barker. It was called The Forbidden, and this was a written story featuring a white man with a red beard in the role of the villainous character. And this would become the basis for the movie. The film also represents a blending of two rather famous urban legends. One involves Bloody Mary, and this is a ghost that will appear if you say her name 5 times while looking into a mirror. So that's certainly a direct connection to Candyman. And then the other legend is the Hook. This would be a monstrous figure who has a sharp metal hook for a hand and uses it to terrorize couples in parked cars. And we certainly see the presence of the Hook in the Candyman film. Now, Virginia Madsen stars in the film as Chicago area graduate student Helen Lyle, and she is working on a college thesis about urban legends and myths. And to her credit, she really takes it seriously. She does lots of interviews with people, lots of research at the library, and her research eventually brings her to the Cabrini Green projects in Chicago. And that is where she learns about the myth of Candyman. And he is the revived form of a 19th century man who was tortured and killed by racists. They cut off his hand, replaced it with a hook, and then left him to be stung by a horde of bees. And that ultimately killed him. Well, as it turns out in the film, Candyman is no myth, but very much a living creature capable of coming back to life and killing. And he is, of course, played by the great Tony Todd. In the movie, Candyman is a monstrous figure. He's got the hooked hand. He emanates from those Cabrini Green housing projects in Chicago. Those were massive apartment buildings with folks struggling economically. There tended to be quite a bit of crime that took place in those buildings as well. Now, the relationship between the character of Helen and Candyman, it really comes to the front when Helen doubts that Candyman exists. And, remember, she's attacked by a guy who calls himself Candyman, just a human, not a supernatural figure. She then goes to the police. She identifies him in a police lineup. He's arrested, and everybody thinks, oh, that's the Candyman. This is not an urban legend. This is just a regular guy, a murderous guy. But he's behind bars now. We don't have to worry about him anymore. So Helen's doubts about Candyman's existence lead to other people doubting because, well, now supposedly the real Candyman is in prison. Not a problem anymore. And this is what spurs Candyman to bring himself back into modern life. Of course, it doesn't help when Helen and her friend Bernadette decide to look into a mirror and say his name 5 times. He doesn't appear immediately, but does make several appearances a bit later on as he manifests himself in modern day Chicago. So that's the basic gist of the film. Tracy, let's get some of your initial thoughts on Candyman. What do you think of it?
Oh my gosh. Candyman is absolutely terrifying, first of all. It really showcases the power of folklore and urban legends while adding that layer of social injustice. And for me personally, I love hearing more about urban legends, and I'm fascinated by the stories. There's so many quirky ones out there, and you just learning about some of the things that people will believe or not believe. And we've all heard, like you mentioned, the Bloody Mary stories and the man with the hook hand. I've always, I've always found Bloody Mary terrifying anyway. It's one of the most scary urban legends that I am aware of. And I have never tested fate by saying her name 5 times. I tried and I couldn't follow through. I'm like, I'm just not tempting fate. So the concept of saying Candyman in the mirror, for me, it mentally scarred me. So that was just a super scary piece of this movie. And I kept thinking to myself, please don't say his name. Please don't say his name. But the storyline was fascinating. And what draws people in to watch it is, who is Candyman? And, you learn more about Helen's personal journey throughout the film. And it was phenomenal. And I really loved it. I thought it was fascinating.
I'll tell you what, there are 2 scenes in particular that freaked me out when I watched it for the first time in theater, but even when I still watch it today. So the first scene is in the parking garage when Helen has just veered off from her friend Bernadette. Helen is going to her parked car, and then she hears this very creepy, deep voice echoing from the distance, Helen, Helen. And right then and there, that Candyman is about to make his first appearance. And it is frightening, obviously, not only to us, but to Helen. She is put into almost a trance. She then blacks out, loses several hours of her memory. When she wakes up, she is in the bathroom of one of the apartments at Cabrini Green. She is covered in blood. And as we're about to find out, she is going to be implicated in a horrible incident where the dog belonging to Vanessa Williams' character has been not only killed, but decapitated. And Vanessa Williams' young daughter, her name in the film is Anne Marie McCoy, her baby has been abducted and taken. And of course, everybody points the finger at Helen. The police point the finger, bring her in for questioning. And that really starts Helen on this terrible downward spiral. So that scene is incredibly frightening, but it's not the only one. I mean, pretty much whenever Candyman appears, it's pretty crazy and it's traumatic. But the other one is when Helen is imprisoned for a second time, and she's in a psychiatric hospital, and she goes in to meet Dr. Burke, who is sort of a combination psychiatrist lawyer. And she feels the only way that she can prove to Dr. Burke that Candyman exists is actually by summoning him. So she looks into a mirror in the office, says the name 5 times, and he appears, although initially we don't see him. Initially, all we see is the doctor starts to sort of retch because the Candyman has put his hook into Dr. Burke's back. We see blood starting to spurt out of his mouth and other parts of his body. And then a moment later, we see Candyman himself. When I first saw that in the film, I didn't really expect an appearance in that fashion. I mean, I thought Candyman would appear, but I didn't think that he was going to sort of come out from behind the doctor and start splitting him, from his nether regions all the way up to his throat. That threw me completely when I saw that for the first time. What'd you think about those two scenes?
Oh my gosh, the one with the doctor, Bruce. Like, I felt that. Like, I felt that when he stuck the hook in there. I was like, I lost my breath. I was like, oh my God. I didn't expect that either. That was just like, I can still see it. I replay that in my head. It's just forceful and visceral. And man, I didn't expect that either. But the scene in the garage, though, that was creepy. And it's Tony Todd's iconic voice. And you can't get that out of your head because that is who he is. Like, that is his voice. And it was not mean or angry. It was just his subtle way to call her name. And it gave me goosebumps because you just knew, yeah, that is it. The time is up and something not great is about to happen.
Great voice, but a great delivery, done with subtlety, tension, and just so effective, so powerful. I mean, the spoken word, if it's delivered properly in a horror film, can have more power than just about anything else. Some other things about the film that make it especially frightening. You look at Candyman, not only is he this horrible murderer who kills people in the most violent ways, especially people close to Helen, but he also frames her for the murders. He leaves evidence in her hands, knives, weapons of various kinds. This leaves the police with no other conclusion that she has to have been responsible. So it's not just the killing, but it's the fact that he wants to implicate her, wants her put in prison. She eventually becomes a fugitive, but she has very little in terms of options. And really, toward the end, she has no other option but to concede to his wishes, at least until the final few moments of the film. So that part is also frightening. Another thing that's great about this movie, part of Candyman was filmed at the actual Cabrini Green housing projects in Chicago. And I think that brings a lot of authenticity to the film. By the way, those housing complex projects no longer exist. The last high-rise apartment at Cabrini Green was torn down in 2011. So when you look at this film, it is a snapshot of Chicago from another time, early 1990s, and that's pretty powerful. Also, the bees that we see in the film are very real. These are not animatronic or special effects. They were real bees that they were used, and they were bred specifically for use in the Candyman movie. Tony Todd actually negotiated a clause in his contract, and this was brilliant on his part, where he would get $1,000 for each bee sting he suffered. And he was stung more than 20 times. Some estimates are 23, others are 26, but we know it was more than 20. So he got more than $20,000. Pretty smart for him to put that in there, don't you think?
I think so.
Yeah. So he was going to make his effort worth it. He knew he was going to get stung. He knew there was no way to avoid that. So he thought, all right, they're going to pay for doing this to me. Tony Todd, by the way, always considered this movie his best film, and he considered Candyman his best role. I would agree. Probably most fans would agree with that assessment. To me, it was obvious only one actor should have ever played Candyman during Tony Todd's life, and that, of course, was Tony Todd himself. His best film, his best portrayal. I think he's absolutely 100% correct on both of those. Now, for some of the other actors, pretty significant movie for Virginia Madsen. It actually turned out to be a breakout role for her career as well. If she had turned down the role, it appears the part would have gone to a young Sandra Bullock, who was relatively unknown at the time, where she's become a superstar in Hollywood since then. To this day, Virginia Madsen points to Candyman as the film that really put her on the map. Here's a quote from her in an interview with Horror News Network. This is what she said. "More people recognize me from that movie than anything I've done. It means a lot to me. It was after years of struggling." And I think it's great to hear this from Madsen because so many stars, and Virginia Madsen has become a star, maybe not at the same level of Sandra Bullock, but still pretty good. A lot of actors who begin in horror or have horror film experiences early on, they then go on to do other things. And it's almost like they disassociate themselves from horror. They don't think the films were that good or not that proud of it. Of course, Candyman's a great movie, so you should be proud of it. And Virginia Madsen is willing to say, yeah, even though this is a horror movie, and horror doesn't always get respect in Hollywood, this is the movie that really made me a significant actress, more than any other. So I think that's an important thing. A third actor, at least one other actor we should talk about, is Xander Berkeley, longtime character actor. He would later play a key role on the Walking Dead series. And I think he does very nicely as Helen's husband. He's a local college professor and seemingly faithful to Helen, but in reality, he's just waiting for the opportunity to leave her and take up with one of his attractive young students. Also, I want to mention briefly some other key players. Vanessa Williams, who plays the young mother in the Cabrini Green projects. She does a very good job. And then there's also Casey Lemons. Casey Lemons, boy, she did great playing secondary roles in two of the best horror movies of the 1990s. One of them, Candyman, the other, The Silence of the Lambs. And in this film, she plays Helen's best friend, Bernadette. Very similar to the role in Silence of the Lambs, the encouraging friend, even though she's not the focal point of attention, still an important character, especially early on. So these are some of the key individual performances. Tracy, curious to get your thoughts on some of these efforts. Anybody in particular that really stands out for you?
Oh my gosh. I think everybody did a wonderful job in this film. I mean, obviously, Tony Todd was phenomenal. And I had no idea, Bruce, that those bees were real. I had no idea. I always thought it was like a special effect or something like that. I have such an irrational fear of bees and wasps. So that just adds like another level of fear factor to this story for me. So he was excellent. And, as weird as it is, his character was terrifying, but he was kind of like gentle at the same time, if you know what I mean. Like he had a story to tell and he did it amazingly well. So that's like an odd combination of like gentle and terrifying, but that's how he was for me. So weird, but so good. And Virginia Madsen, she's such an underrated performer. She was excellent as Helen, and she was very, very powerful. I mean, she started out as like a debunker while researching the Candyman urban legend. And, she went as far to explore Cabrini Green without considering her surroundings or the impact of the tragic death of Ruthie Jean. And, as the story unfolds, she became more involved in this urban legend. And you could see her transform from like a skeptic into acceptance of Candyman and, eventually really becoming an urban legend herself. And I honestly don't think anybody else could have done that role. You mentioned Sandra Bullock. It might have gone to her if Virginia declined. I cannot see Sandra Bullock. Like, I can't even imagine her performance. She's a great actress, don't get me wrong, but she is not this kind of actress. I don't think she would have been able to pull it off. And Xander Berkeley, I really like him as an actor. He's been in so many different TV and film projects, and he's so underrated. He always has the roles that are done so well that you really
Yeah,
dislike the character.
right.
So
He's always a weasel.
exactly. He played like that kind of a character in the 24 series as George Mason and, the Walking Dead character. But in this role, he was really, really good. And, I automatically knew he was 100% unfaithful to Helen anyway and put on the act of the doting husband. But let's just say he got quite the exit and it was well deserved.
Yeah.
so,
So right
but
from the
yeah.
beginning, you thought he was cheating on her.
Oh, absolutely. As soon as
Yeah.
like Virginia Madsen's character walked into the auditorium when he was teaching and speaking
Yeah.
to that girl, I'm like, mm-hmm.
Yeah. I guess I'm a little more naive. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. But as soon as Helen, was imprisoned and she was there for about a month, and by then he's already got that young college girl, the blonde, Stacy, I think was her name.
Mm-hmm.
She's already living with him, and they're putting up new paint colors in the apartment. I mean, they didn't wait very long, did they?
No, that's right. They had to paint it that Pepto-Bismol pink.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it's great when Helen comes in, she's on the run, she's a fugitive, and she kind of makes a remark saying, I don't really like the color scheme all that much. With all the problems Helen's got, she's got a moment to take issue with the paint and the appearance of the apartment. Another one of the interesting scenes. A lot of great performances all the way around. Berkeley, certainly Madsen, of course, Tony Todd. But also Vanessa Williams and Casey Lemon's also quite good in this movie. And the young boy, the actor who played the young boy living at the Cabrini Green apartments, his character is named Jake. And I was reading on IMDb, they actually called him One Take Jake because pretty much every scene that he did, he was able to deliver his lines smoothly in one take. Not always easy, especially for a child actor. So that was impressive as well.
Oh,
you look at the film in total, it's not a stretch to say that Candyman is one of the best horror films of the last 35 years. Beyond that, Candyman is easily one of the top 25 horror films of all time, and that's a conservative thought on that. It might be ranked higher. Not only is it frightening and creepy, but it is a well-told story with a message, features great special effects, tremendous performances. I give it 4 stars for the original 1992 version of Candyman. Tracy, your ranking of the film.
I love this movie, Bruce. It's one of those films that just leaves that lasting impression. I watched it again the other night, and it still holds up to the test of time. It is not cheesy. It is not weird. It's not cheap. It is still truly terrifying. And I attribute that to the acting and Tony Todd. He'll always be Candyman to me. And I have to give this 4.5 stars. Just phenomenal.
No question that it holds up. So Tracy goes 4.5 stars. I go 4 stars for the film that came out 32 years ago. Candyman,
oh my goodness.
Starring the great Tony Todd. Well, that is our wrap up of our tribute to Tony Todd. We're going to take a short break, but we still have more to come. When we come back, we will talk about a new film just hitting theaters in early November. It is called Heretic. It stars an actor that we don't really think of as a horror actor, but he does a pretty good job. And the film itself is pretty good. We'll be back to talk about Heretic in a moment. Stay with us on the Ghostly Gallery. Welcome back to the Ghostly Gallery podcast. Bruce Markison and Tracy Asteria along with you. In our final segment on this week's podcast, we want to talk about a new film just came out early November, and it's received a little bit of buzz, some positive attention. The film is called Heretic, and it stars longtime actor Hugh Grant as a man named Mr. Reed. He's a guy who has expressed interest in learning more about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known more commonly as the Mormon religion. In response, the local Mormon church sends two young missionaries. They are named Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton, played respectively by Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East. So they go to visit his home and tell him more about the church. At first, Mr. Reed is exceedingly polite, charming. He invites these young ladies into the house. Now, the two young missionaries, they're very careful. They inform him that there must be a female present in the house during their visit. Otherwise, they're not allowed to come in. Well, Mr. Reed assures them that his wife is indeed in the house. He tells them that his wife is baking a blueberry pie in the kitchen, and he offers to serve them some during their visit. He then goes back into the kitchen after they've come into the house, but Mr. Reed returns by himself, without his wife and without the blueberry pie. Now, the conversation between Mr. Reed and the two missionaries begins very politely, smoothly, but then it changes tenor when Mr. Reed begins to shift the conversation suddenly. At one moment, he's talking about serious topics, then he goes to trivial ones, and then goes back again to serious ones. At one moment, he asks Sister Barnes how her father died. She explains that he passed away from Lou Gehrig's disease. And then out of nowhere, without really any kind of natural transition, he brings up the topic of the blueberry pie again. Very weird. And then Mr. Reed turns the conversation in a serious direction with a very pointed question about the Mormon practice of men having multiple wives. And it's obvious from the way that he frames the question. Reed disagrees with the practice, says it was only adopted because apparently the founder of the Mormons was cheating on his wife. At least that's what he says in the film. So this erratic nature of the conversation understandably begins to concern Sisters Barnes and Paxton. They become even more concerned when they notice that one of the candles Mr. Reed has brought out to the table is actually a scented candle, scented blueberry. And that's a red flag there because it indicates there is no blueberry pie that's being made at the current time. Additionally, Mr. Reed's wife never makes an appearance. So the two missionaries, before too long, they begin to suspect that she does not exist at all. Well, Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton become concerned enough that they decide we better get out of here. They try to leave through the front door, but it is locked and bolted, and they just cannot figure out how to open the door. When they go toward the back of the house to find Mr. Reed, they inquire as to why the door will not open. And he comes up with this explanation that the door is on a timed lock. It will not open till the next morning. But he says they're free to leave through the back of the house, which can be accessed through one of two doors in that back room, which also happens to look a lot like a small chapel. Well, the two missionaries, understandably, they express some resistance, saying, hey, this is odd. You know, you want us to leave through a back door after coming in through the front? Why do you even have a timer on the door? Why is it locked till the morning? Doesn't make any sense. And then the conversation really takes an even weirder turn as Mr. Reed starts talking about the evolution of the board game Monopoly, which apparently at one time was called the landlord's game. And he compares it to the evolution of religion and how each major religion basically borrows ideas from the others. He also talks about similar iterations of songs. That's a word that he emphasizes a lot, iterations, how one musical group actually steals a song from an earlier generation of a different group. And he compares this to what religious leaders have done in creating their own iterations of religion, with none of them really being authentic or original. So as you can tell, Mr. Reed, he's quite a character, to say the least. So Tracy, at this point, what did you think of all this going on?
I have one weird. Wow. Actually, I have two words. Wow and weird. Um, that's pretty much all I can say. I mean, Bruce, I've seen a couple of trailers for this film, and I was really looking forward to seeing it. Um, it looked kind of creepy in the trailers, so that was like a key for me. And honestly, it was Hugh Grant that was in this film, and as weird as it is, I'm not really familiar with his work. Um, just a side note, looking through his IMDb, I realized I've actually never seen him in anything before. So this was my first time seeing him act. Um, he's more of a romantic comedy type fella, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I had super high expectations. It's an A24 production, and A24 is really well known for horror films that are quirky, psychological, horror-ish type movies like Hereditary and Midsummer.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like really hyped up for it. For me, it leaned a little too heavy into the religious aspect. Oh, Hugh Grant had so much dialogue, and because he was speaking so much, I think my attention span kind of drifted off a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, I watched it a little bit later in the night, so that might have played a bit of a role in my perception. But
it's a
I feel
very
like
talky film. There's a
it
lot of
is.
conversation, especially early.
Exactly. And granted, Hugh Grant has a wonderful voice. I feel like they really could have went somewhere with this storyline. There's so many possibilities. But overall, I think they could have done a better job with the sisters Paxton and Burns. But I think those are kind of like my initial thoughts of this one. Weird and wow.
Tracy, Hugh Grant has been around for a long time. He's become known as the romantic comedy guy. He's done a lot of dramas. He's done some serious films. He's done some lighter films. I don't remember him ever doing another horror film. He may have done one or two along the way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember any of them, none that had a huge impact. So this was a little bit of a stretch for him. I actually thought he was quite good. I think he did a good job as this plotting, conniving Mr. Reed, who's obviously an expert at playing mind games, doesn't answer questions directly, never really admits that he doesn't have a wife and that she's not in the house. Although at one point he kind of hints that, yeah, I made her up. He's a kind of a combination politician, lawyer, speaker of double talk.
Yes.
He can't say anything straightforward or directly, either in answering a question or really even in posing a question to these young sisters here. And I thought he actually was pretty good in the role, but I think you're absolutely right that he was given too much dialogue. Mm-hmm. And there was just a little bit too much conversation, especially in the first part of the movie. It was talky. There's some action toward the end and some serious developments toward the end, but it takes a while for us to get to that stage. Mm-hmm. Another interesting observation, at least from my standpoint, the first names of the three main characters, Mr. Reed, Sister Paxton, Sister Barnes. We never hear what their first names are. They're never referred to. None of the characters ever give out their first names, at least not that I remember. Was kind of wondering if that was done on purpose and what the significance might be. I don't know what the significance might be. Any thoughts on that, Tracy?
Oh, that's so weird now that you mention that. Um, I don't think they gave their names either. And I want to say that maybe it was to make it less personal, maybe. Um, so like this could have happened to anybody that came to the house to discuss the church
Mm,
and not
yeah,
necessarily just the two sisters. It could have been anybody, and maybe that's why they chose not to just give names. I think giving their names would have made it like a personal kind of attack. I
yeah,
think maybe maybe that might be it. It's so hard to tell. It was weird. I never really noticed
yeah.
that.
It's a good theory. You think about it. He's really not mad at them. He's more mad at the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter Day Saints, and he's
Mhm.
mad at religion in general. He is a heretic. I don't think he ever comes out and says that he's an atheist, but he does seem to have doubts about any religion at all.
Mhm.
So that's where he's directing his anger. It's not at these two young women who, I mean, they were so young looking. They look like they were in high school. I think they're supposed to be
Yes.
older, but it seemed like they were 16, 17 years of age. I'm not sure exactly what their real life ages are, but they look very, very young in the film. Another thing that was curious was the role for Topher Grace. He's the actor that, of course, got his start on that 70s show. He was kind of the centerpiece to that program, a comedy for many, many years. And he's a pretty good actor, but he was given this very limited role that I didn't understand. He plays Elder Kennedy, and he is the church representative who goes out in search of Sister Paxton and Sister Barnes when they don't report back to the church, to the headquarters. But he gives up rather easily on the search. He interviews, or not interviews, but he asks a few questions of Mr. Reed, who comes to the door. Mr. Reed not so convincingly lies that he hasn't seen these two young women, that he's not had a visit from these missionaries. I'm not really buying it. I don't know if Topher Grace's character is really buying it, but he leaves. He doesn't sneak around to the side of the house to try to look in a window. He doesn't really do any follow up. The only follow up that he does, he comes back a little while later, and that's only to give the guy a brochure for the Mormons. He's got to have the brochure. That's the only reason he comes back. And then we don't see him again. I kept waiting for him to, somehow make his way into the house, become involved in rescuing these two young missionaries. Nothing, nada, doesn't happen. So I kind of wondered exactly why they had his character. It's just a dead end. It just didn't go
Mhm.
anywhere. And then another flaw of this film was the lack of common sense smarts that we sometimes, uh, we don't see it displayed by Sister Paxton and Sister Barnes. They're intelligent. They one of them knows a lot about the history of the Mormons. They're pretty well spoken. These are smart young women, but they didn't have any common sense. They had several opportunities after going into the basement, which is like a dungeon, opportunities to try to escape when Mr. Reed comes down, and they never take advantage of it. Mr. Reed is not exactly a powerhouse. I mean, he's not an intimidating physical figure. You thought at one point maybe they would try to overtake him, do something, and yet they don't. Maybe they were so scared. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. But that's stretch credibility in my mind. And then to me, the big question is toward the end of the film, after Sister Paxton is able to finally escape to the main part of the house, for some reason she returns to the basement. I didn't understand why. I mean, did she not have enough of Mr. Reed's craziness to go back down there? Why in the world would she do that? I didn't get that. Maybe I missed something. What'd you think of that?
No, I have no idea why she went back down. I was like, good for her. She's out of there now
Yeah.
and clear to escape. And next thing you know, she's sauntering down to the dungeon. I was just kind of like, you're going the wrong way, lady.
Right.
But no, she just went down there and that was the end.
Yeah, I just I did not understand that. That was
No.
bizarre. Maybe she thought that she could rescue Sister Barnes, although it seemed that without giving out too much away here, it seemed that the stab wound to her neck was pretty severe.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out that she was still alive, but it didn't seem like it at the time. Why go back down there? I mean, I would do anything to get out of the house, break a window, uh, you know, start digging. I don't know what, just get out of that house however you can do it. But going into the basement, there's no exit down there. There's
Oh.
only this creepy Mr. Reed who's out of his mind. That just was bizarre. It really. So I think that hurt the film. Even though it's a pretty good movie in some other ways. Some of the developments are very surprising. It turns out there are other people that are in part of the house, kind of a secret location. And we slowly realize, just what a dastardly figure Mr. Reed is. But that is unveiled, slowly, gradually, I think in an effective way. But some of these, I don't know if you want to call them plot holes or just lack of credibility, really do hurt some of the flow of the film. So given some of these flaws, Tracy, that I mentioned, I lessened my rating. I was getting ready to give this a higher rating, maybe 3.5 stars. And then the ending just didn't leave me satisfied. I just wasn't convinced by it. It's not the great film that I was led to believe based on all these online reviews and all the chatter about it. It's a good film. It's worth seeing. It's entertaining, but it's not a classic. So I give Heretic 3 stars. Am I being too generous? What do you think?
I thought it was a really odd movie. The whole religious aspect. I really I thought it might have been some kind of a satanic type storyline. You had mentioned Topher Grace's character earlier, and when they did the initial pan to him in kind of like the church, wondering where the girls were, I kind of thought, well, maybe he had something to do with it, that he had sent the girls there. And so when he showed back up a little later on, I was like, oh, I guess maybe that wasn't true.
Yeah, I
But,
kind of thought that too. I thought
yeah,
he
it was
might be
weird.
involved somehow.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
it wasn't. So that whole character line totally threw me off too.
Yeah.
I really don't know what I expected from this movie, but it really wasn't this. Hugh Grant was very creepy. Or charming, maybe, I don't know, combination of both. He tried. He had so much dialogue and he did a really great job with it, don't get me wrong. Both girls were really great. I thought, oh goodness, which sister was it? I think it was Sister Paxton. They played her very naive. She played a very naive type character. And I thought it was a little bit outdated, maybe. But again, maybe it was the religious component where she was deeply religious. But she did really well. On the flip side, Sister Barnes, she was more street savvy, the one who knew more about the religion and who was kind of a little bit spunky. I was just really surprised with the outcome for her character, without giving it away.
Yeah.
So I thought, if anything, it would have been the other way around. But it was dark. The atmosphere of the house in the basement, I felt was unsettling. Honestly, in this day and age, in my eyes, I would never be walking up to a house like that in the middle of nowhere with a storm brewing and, having creepy Mr. Reed standing there at the door saying, come on in.
Yeah.
It's just a recipe for disaster. And that's a no from me. Overall, it was kind of okay. I expected way more action, I guess, like something supernatural, maybe. I think that's the vibe I was getting from this film, that it was supposed to be like that. I don't think I'd watch it again. Once was more than enough. And I would probably give it a 2.5 stars. They tried, but the ending, you're right. Like the ending is what kind of like threw everything into the wayside. So only 2.5, but it's worth a watch. It really is, because it's different and it's a different role for Hugh Grant.
Yeah.
Or first exposure, if you're like me.
Yeah, his character, Mr. Reed, was charming for about 6 or 7 minutes. And then after that, he's just a wacko.
Yes.
He's just out of his mind. And maybe there's some basis to his, comparison of the religions and them stealing from each other. But I think there was also a lot of oversimplification, which, as you mentioned, Sister Barnes, the more sophisticated of the two, she really tried to refute that. When he starts talking about how the Jewish religion is not more popular in the world, and it's because they don't go door to door like the Mormons do. And she brought up the very pertinent point. Well, what about the Holocaust? You haven't mentioned that, and that had a pretty big impact too. So I think right then and there, she showed herself to be more than a match for Mr. Reed.
Exactly.
But yeah, he was a bizarre character. He really was. An interesting movie. So you give it 2.5 stars. I give it 3. I might watch it again just to see if I could answer some questions about some of the what I felt were nonsensical decisions by the actors. Maybe I missed something. Maybe something subtle was on the screen. Maybe.
That's true.
Might watch it for that reason alone. It's worth a single watch. It's pretty good. It's okay, but it's not the great film that some have made it out to be. And I really think that's the reality. And I'm glad that you agree with me on
it. I would love to know what other people think of this film too, because, I haven't really heard a lot about it. I mean, yes, I know it's still like fairly new. I think it's been out for maybe about a month or so. But, by this time, I would think that you would hear different thoughts from people, out in the real world. And I've not heard anybody really talking about this film except for maybe the occasional online review or something like that, but no real chatter about it.
It's not Late Night with the Devil, and it's not Long Legs, which of the films I've seen this year are the two best. I know that you're a fan of both of those as well. It's just not at the level of those two movies, which came out earlier in 2024. Well, Tracy, thank you for your thoughts, not only on Heretic, but also Candyman, and also the great career of Tony Todd. Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. This has been a treat.
Well, treat for me as well. We hope it's been a treat for the listeners. We thank all of you for joining us here in the Ghostly Gallery in this Museum of the Macabre. And we do hope we'll see you again next time right here in the Ghostly Gallery.